States. I've been involved with value pricing since 1998 when I brought the third value pricing project in the country online in Florida, and it was actually the first one to impact all lanes. So I've been doing this for a little bit of time. All right. I am going to go relatively short. I'm kind of like the trailers in front of the main feature of the movie. So I know you want to get to the actual proposals, but I do want to spend a little bit of time on how we actually did what we did. We did have the overall project area defined by the legislature, and it goes obviously from the Columbia River down to the I-5-205 interchange, recognizing that that's not a totally homogeneous area. I-5 and the Rose Quarter is much different than I-5 down near the 5-205 interchange. We did break it into segments so that we could take into account those differences. We based it on four major issues. One of them is traffic operations. We've got to see, is it going to work? Is it going to actually do anything? The next is, what can we do with alternative forms of transportation? How does it benefit those? Next, can we build it? What are the physical constraints that we have to deal with? And those vary tremendously through the corridor. And in the overall scheme of things, we also looked at the impacts that would potentially be on the environmental justice communities in the overall Portland area. They carried a little heavier weighting than other things. We did an average score for the three of all the pairs, and there's a reason we did that. We got tremendous amounts of information out of the traffic model. I think we got about 8 or 9 different factors that we could rate. A lot less when you're looking at capital costs. It's basically one. Alternative modes, are alternative modes available? Could they be made available? What we did not want to happen was that the traffic operations would totally overwhelm the overall selection process, so we averaged them into these large groups and then equally weighted those groups so that we did not overwhelm things just with how well would it work. You've seen these concepts before. I believe that you all actually decided these in the last meeting that you had. One is the baseline, no improvements whatsoever. It's what's out there, not only today, but in 2027, the improvements that are already planned in the RTP. Next would be tolling all facilities on both 5 and 205, then converting one lane to a managed lane on 5 and 205, building a new lane, concept number 4 on both 5 and 205, and then we move into 4, what I call hybrid concepts, where we took some from column A, some from column B, and put them together to see how they would work. The baseline conditions. I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't already know. You've got severe traffic congestion here in Portland areas. It's definitely worse on some areas of 5 and 205 than it is on other areas of 5 and 205. You have what we call hyper congestion going on, particularly on I-5. And let me explain a little bit about what hypercongestion is. That is a situation where it's not just that traffic is a little sluggish, you're moving at 35 or 40 miles an hour, but you're getting there. It's a situation where your flow breaks down completely on your corridor. I mean, the worst case, you'll see it for a couple of seconds at a time, is when you're literally stopped on the freeway in stop and go traffic. We've looked at actual traffic counts, and the congestion is so bad, particularly on I-5 Portland North, that instead of moving the 1,400 or 1,500 vehicles per hour that you should be able to use, you're moving about 700 vehicles per hour during those off-peak times. It's kind of a hard concept to wrap your head around, but when you see a tremendous amount of vehicles on the freeway, that does not mean that you are moving a lot of vehicles through the freeway. And in your worst congestion, you are actually about cutting your capacity in half. Some of the initial work on this was actually done in Washington State by Doug McDonald when he was the DOT secretary up there. They saw very similar things in Seattle, so it's not unique. Your traffic speeds drop to around 10 miles an hour. It just isn't real good. But again, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. Sure. Okay. So let's get to the actual concepts that we tested. And the first one is we'll toll all lanes and variably price them, value price them on both I-5 and 205. This actually tested very well on most segments of 5 and most segments of 205. The blue is excellent. The yellow is pretty good. The orange, we're starting to get a little funky, and red is not that great. Now, I'm going to take a very quick moment here and talk a little bit about professional judgment. And we know, for instance, that you really should not be reducing the number of trips that you're seeing on the roadway, but the model doesn't know that, and sometimes it would. It's called a regional transportation model, and it's a very, very effective tool for deciding where you've got congestion. It's not a perfect tool, but it's the best we've got in trying to determine where you can increase efficiency. So we're not totally buying in that north of Portland on 5 northbound is a problem, but southbound is great. But this overall did fairly well. I think the lower scores that you're seeing on 205 reflect the fact that in this model we've already got the 3rd lane in on the Abernathy Bridge, and on 205 west over to Stafford Road, excuse me. I think that's why it didn't score quite as well. But overall, this one did pretty good. This is convert a lane, to take one lane that you've got on 5 and one lane that you have on 205 and make it a priced, managed lane. It didn't do as well, and there are a lot of reasons for this. I want to talk very quickly about the Rose Quarter and the fact that there are a lot of places through there that you only have 2 through lanes. And the fact is, you really can't convert one lane to a managed lane and leave the other lane a general purpose lane where you only have 2 lanes. And the reason for this is traffic just doesn't flow very well. I'm sure all of you have been on a 2-lane road when you get stuck behind somebody who's traveling very slowly, you can't get around them, or conversely, when you're moving at what you think is a reasonable pace and you've got some person behind you that just thinks we need to be taken off to the Indianapolis 500. So single lane facilities just are much less efficient in general, and to have basically 2 single lane facilities, which is what you would have if you converted one lane on the 2-lane segment, just is not going to perform very well. So we don't even think this is a feasible alternative in the Rose Quarter itself. Other areas it could potentially work, but it still has some downsides. First of all, somebody already said something about the broader we toll, the lower the individual toll would be. That's absolutely the case here. We would expect tolls several times higher for a managed lane compared to tolling all lanes. So you're going to get some real advantage to travelers that they're not going to have to pay the highest toll as they would here. Secondly, under Oregon law, heavy vehicles cannot get into the leftmost lane, which is the lane that would work best for conversion. That includes heavy trucks, so freight is not going to see any advantage. And very importantly, it includes transit vehicles. So your transit vehicles are not going to see the advantage in this scenario that they would see in a toll all lane scenario or some of the other things that we looked at. So we weren't surprised that this one did not do that well. Build a new lane. Guess what? building a new lane does move a lot of traffic, and there's absolutely no denying that. However, it's not the panacea that it might appear to be. And I'm not even going to talk too much about the cost, although the cost on this one is orders of magnitude higher than the cost that we looked at on a lot of these others. But it also has the most significant impact on businesses and other residences, people having to be dislocated to move out of the way. It has the highest impact on EJ communities. It's got a lot of negatives to go along with it, and the cost, particularly Rose Quarter, would be astronomical. I can't even imagine what it would be to really do this. So from a financial standpoint, doesn't work that well. You might think, well, why don't we just do it in a few areas? Well, that doesn't work too well either because of a little thing we call lane balance. If I put 4 lanes in between 2 3-lane sections, that's going to create a problem at both ends when the other lane drops out, and you're going to end up backing up traffic onto that 4-lane section, and you're really not going to get a tremendous amount of benefit from it. In fact, if we did do it through the entire distance of both 5 and 205, at the northern end, you've got a 3-lane bridge that you're going into, and on 5 particularly, it's not just a 3-lane bridge, it's a very tight 3-lane bridge. So those 4 lanes are going to drop into a system that just cannot handle that much traffic. And on the south end, you've got the 5-205 interchange, and then the areas on 5 south of that could also have problems. So we just didn't see this going too many places, with one exception, and that's where on 205 you currently have a 2-lane bridge and a 2-lane segment. So might be some benefit to looking at it there, because you've got 3-lane segments on either side, so you don't have this whole issue with lane balance. In fact, you're helping your lane balance in that particular case. We now move into what I call the hybrids. This would be constructing a new lane on 205 and not doing anything on 5. Again, not surprisingly, if we didn't have all the problems with lane balance, and we didn't have all the problems with price, and we didn't have all the problems with community impacts, we could move some pretty significant traffic on 5. One thing the model did that we don't quite agree with is it did try to force some traffic from 205 to 5 to avoid the toll. I'm just not sure that realistically would happen, but it is what the model is showing us. But using professional judgment, we're not buying into that. So we don't think there will be tremendous impacts on 5 from this, at least not to the extent that the model is showing us. But there are a lot of other reasons that this one did not make a tremendous amount of sense to us. Tolling all lanes on I-5 versus not doing anything on 205 showed pretty good on 5. And that area that we had northbound, and this is one of the reasons we didn't quite buy off on it when we looked at the whole thing, everything's looking really good. So it'll work. We are seeing some diversion to 205. I think if we told it right, we might not see that. It could be a good interim step at some point, but we like other things a little bit better. This gets into converting a GP lane. Again, we just don't think that's a viable option, particularly on 5. And a toll all lanes on 205 does bring about some benefits, but again, we think there are other options that are better than this particular hybrid. Convert and construct a new lane. Again, we just think that there's some better options than this particular option, and we're not sure that this hybrid really carried a lot of benefits compared to some of the other things that we saw.